Michael and I had been friends for years, the kind of friendship built on late-night conversations, shared secrets, and an unspoken trust that made it easy to exist in each other's space. We met in college, him, the effortlessly confident athlete, and me, the quiet observer who always felt a little out of place. Despite our differences, we clicked in a way that felt natural, easy. But ease can be deceptive. It was never my intention to fall for Michael. He was straight, after all. At least, that's what he told me, what he told everyone. Over the years, I became an expert at suppressing the occasional spark that surfaced in his presence, convincing myself it was nothing, just admiration twisted by proximity. But some truths refused to stay buried. We were sharing an apartment for the summer, a convenient arrangement that saved money and, on the surface, made sense. Michael had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I was in between jobs, trying to figure out my next move. The apartment was small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms separated by a thin wall and a shared living space that always smelled faintly of his cologne and my coffee. For the most part, things felt normal. We fell into a routine. Morning runs for him, late-night movie marathons for both of us, easy banter that filled the silence. But there were moments, fleeting and subtle, when something shifted. Like the way his gaze would linger a second too long when I spoke, or how his voice softened in ways it never did with others. It was easy to ignore, easier still to pretend it was my imagination. One night, we sat on the couch, half watching an old movie neither of us really cared about. Michael nursed a beer, his long legs stretched out across the coffee table. "You ever think about relationships?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, contemplative. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Yeah, sometimes." He nodded, staring at the screen, but not really watching. "It's weird, being single again. I got so used to someone always being there, you know?" I swallowed, trying not to read into it. "Yeah, I get that." A comfortable silence settled between us, but my mind was anything but still. I wanted to ask what he meant if there was something behind his words, but I didn't. Some questions are better left unspoken. The next morning, I woke up early, the apartment still heavy with sleep. Michael had gone for a run, his absence leaving the space feeling strangely empty. I lingered in bed longer than usual, letting the quiet settle over me before finally dragging myself up. The shower was a sanctuary, a place where I could think without interruption, without pretense. The water was warm, soothing, and for a few moments, I allowed myself to relax. I stepped out, wrapping a towel around my waist as I made my way back to my room. The door was ajar. I never bothered closing it when I was alone. I was halfway through pulling a shirt over my head when I heard it. The sound of the front door opening, followed by the unmistakable creak of the floorboards. Michael was back. Before I could react, before I could move, he walked in. And for the first time in our friendship, silence wasn't easy. It was heavy, suffocating. Michael froze. His eyes met mine, widened slightly, then flickered downward before snapping back up. A beat passed. 2. Neither of us spoke. I wanted to say something to break the tension, but my throat was dry. My heart pounded, my skin suddenly too warm despite the cool air. Michael's expression was unreadable. Shock, embarrassment, something else I couldn't name. And then, just as quickly as it happened, he turned. "Shit, sorry, I thought you were still asleep," he muttered, stepping back, the door closing between us. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. But even as I stood there, trying to brush it off as an accident, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. The hours after Michael walked in were heavy with silence. Not the usual kind, the easy, comfortable quiet that naturally formed between 2 people who knew each other well. No, this was a different silence. It weighed on me, thick and intrusive, like a question waiting for an answer I didn't know how to give. I stayed in my room for longer than necessary, pretending to scroll through my phone while my mind replayed the moment on a loop. The way his eyes had flickered over me before he'd turned away. The flush creeping up his neck as he mumbled his apology. The sharp inhale I hadn't meant to take when I caught him staring. Maybe it was nothing, just awkwardness. Anyone would be uncomfortable after walking in on their friend like that. But then, why couldn't I shake the feeling that it wasn't just embarrassment in his eyes? Why did it feel like something unspoken passed between us, too quick to grasp, but impossible to ignore? Eventually, I forced myself to leave the room. I couldn't hide forever, not without making things worse. Michael was in the kitchen, his back to me, rummaging through a cabinet for something, probably a snack to mask the discomfort. He was wearing an old hoodie, sleeves pushed up to reveal the faint lines of muscle on his forearms. His hair was still damp from the shower, and for a second, I wished I didn't notice things like that. "Hey," I said, my voice more casual than I felt. He turned around quickly, as if I'd startled him. "Hey, sorry about earlier, man. I should have knocked." "It's fine," I replied, waving it off like it was no big deal. "You didn't know." But his eyes didn't meet mine. He focused instead on the countertop, fingers drumming nervously. "Still, I feel like an idiot. It happens. No harm done." I grabbed a glass of water just to have something to do with my hands. The air between us was tight, stretched thin by things neither of us knew how to say. An awkward pause settled in. This wasn't us, not the way we usually talked, not the easy flow we'd always had. I hated how this one stupid moment had cracked something between us, even if it was just a fracture. "You sure you're cool?" Michael asked, finally looking up. His eyes were softer now, concern cutting through the discomfort. "I didn't, make you feel weird or anything." "Weird?" The question stuck in my throat like a splinter. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him it was nothing, but the truth was more complicated. I wasn't embarrassed because I was naked. I was embarrassed because, for a split second, part of me wanted him to look. "I'm fine," I said too quickly. A practice lie. "Seriously, don't worry about it." Michael nodded, but the tension lingered. Maybe he sensed there was more to it, or maybe I was just projecting my own feelings onto him. Either way, the easy camaraderie we'd always shared had taken a hit, and I wasn't sure how to fix it. Later that night, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the encounter. His expression, his body language, the slight hesitation before he turned away. I was reading too much into it. I had to be. Michael was straight. He always had been. And yet, the memory of his gaze lingering for just a heartbeat too long refused to fade. The next day, we both pretended nothing had happened. Breakfast was quiet. Michael scrolled through his phone, pretending to be invested in whatever was on the screen, while I focused on my coffee like it held the answers I couldn't find in him. "So," he said suddenly, setting his phone down, "you doing anything tonight?" The question caught me off guard. "Not really." "Why?" "Thinking of hitting up that new bar downtown. Could use a night out. You in?" It felt like an olive branch, a way to reset the dynamic without actually addressing what had happened. I could have said no, claimed I was tired or had work to catch up on, but the truth was I didn't want things to stay like this. "Yeah," I agreed, offering a small smile. "Sound good." The bar was loud, filled with too many bodies and not enough space. Music pulsed through the floor, vibrating under our feet. Michael seemed more relaxed here, surrounded by strangers and distractions. He ordered us drinks, and we found a spot near the back where the noise dulled just enough for conversation. "Better, right?" he asked, handing me a beer. "Yeah," I lied. "Better." We talked about nothing: sports, mutual friends, his ex-girlfriend who'd recently moved to another city. It was easy, almost too easy, and for a while I let myself believe things could go back to normal. But then, sometime between the second drink and the third, Michael leaned in closer, his voice low, so I could hear him over the music. "About the other day." My chest tightened. "Forget it. It wasn't a big deal." "No, He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I didn't mean to make things weird between us. You're my best friend, man. I don't want anything to mess that up." "Nothing's messed up," I said, but the lie tasted bitter now. His gaze held mine for a little too long, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to say something else, something I wasn't ready to hear. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, taking another sip of his drink, and just like that, the moment passed. Later, walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable this time, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had shifted, subtle, invisible but undeniable. When we reached the apartment, Michael paused at his bedroom door. "Night, man," he said, voice low and tired. "Night." I closed my door behind me and leaned against it, my heart heavy with things unsaid. And for the first time since we'd moved in together, I wasn't sure if our friendship would ever go back to what it used to be. The days after that night stretched out like an awkward silence made tangible, long, drawn-out moments where everything looked normal, but nothing felt the same. Michael and I still shared meals, exchanged casual words, and filled the air with the usual noise of roommates living side by side. But underneath the surface, something jagged had wedged itself between us. I noticed it in the small things first. The way his laughter came a little too quickly, a little too loud, as if to smother any trace of discomfort. The way he avoided sitting too close on the couch, subtly maintaining a buffer of space that hadn't been there before. And then there were the moments when I caught him staring. Not like before, not fleeting glances of something unsaid, but with this almost guarded curiosity, like he was trying to solve a puzzle without letting me know he was even looking. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that I noticed, or the fact that I wanted there to be something behind those looks. I spent more time in my room now, scrolling through my phone without reading anything, headphones and just to avoid hearing the creak of the floorboards as Michael moved around outside. It was ridiculous. This was his apartment too, but the weight of the unspoken had turned every shared space into a minefield. One evening, as I was half-heartedly working through a playlist I'd already listened to 3 times that week, there was a knock on my door. Not his usual casual tap, but a deliberate, hesitant knock that made my stomach twist. "Yeah?" My voice was flat, cautious. The door opened just enough for him to lean in. His hair was damp from a shower, curling slightly at the edges, and the faint scent of his soap drifted into the room. A detail I shouldn't have noticed, but did anyway. "Hey, you good?" His voice was low, tentative. I forced a smile. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be?" His eyes searched mine for a beat too long. "I don't know. Just feels like we've been off lately." Off. A perfect word for something neither of us could say outright. "I guess I've just been busy," I lied. Michael nodded slowly, but his expression didn't ease. "All right, well, if you want to hang out or something later, let me know." His voice was light, like it wasn't a big deal, but I could hear the strain under it. "Yeah, sure." I didn't mean for the words to sound as hollow as they did, but it was too late to take them back. He closed the door, and the silence returned, thicker than before. The next day, Michael left early for work, and for the first time in days, the apartment felt breathable. I moved through the space like I was trying to relearn it. How the sunlight hit the kitchen counter at noon, how the faint hum of traffic seeped through the windows when everything else was quiet. But peace didn't last long. As I made coffee, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Hey, drinks after work? Just us. Underscore." I stared at the screen for longer than necessary before typing back a simple. "Yeah, sure. That night, we ended up at a small dive bar, quieter than the crowded chaos of the last place we'd been. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses felt oddly comforting, like background noise for thoughts we couldn't voice yet. Michael ordered the first round, 2 beers, nothing fancy, and we settled into a booth tucked away from the rest of the room. For a while, we talked like nothing had happened. Sports, work, random jokes that didn't quite land the way they used to. But the effort was visible now, like we were both trying too hard to find a rhythm that no longer existed. Finally, after a sip of his second drink, Michael spoke. "So about that night," my stomach tightened. "What about it?" His gaze dropped to the table, fingers tracing the edge of his glass. "I don't know. It's just, you've been different since then. Distant." I let out a breath, steady and careful. "You walked in on me naked, Mike. That's bound to make things weird." He flinched like I'd hit a nerve. "Yeah, but it's more than that, isn't it?" The question hung between us like smoke. I should have denied it, should have brushed it off with another half-truth, but the weight of all the unsaid things pressed too hard against my chest. "What if it is?" I asked quietly. His eyes snapped up, and for the first time, there was no buffer of casual distance, just raw confusion and something else, something unreadable. "Look," I continued, my voice steady but low, "I'm not going to make this a thing if you don't want it to be. You're my best friend, and that's what matters. But pretending nothing's changed isn't working either. Michael was silent for a long time, his thumb running along the condensation on his glass. Finally, he spoke, voice barely audible. "I don't know what this is. That makes two of us." His jaw tightened, like he was wrestling with something internal. I didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't." And in a way, that was the truth. He hadn't hurt me. Expectation had. My own feelings, buried for so long, were the real culprit here. We finished the night in silence, walking home side by side but miles apart in thought. When we reached the apartment, he paused at his door again, the same hesitation as before. "Night," he said, voice soft. "Night," I echoed, though it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something neither of us knew how to name yet. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of routine and unspoken tension. Every conversation between Michael and me felt like we were dancing around the same invisible line, too cautious to cross it, too afraid to acknowledge it was even there. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the glances, the hesitations, the lingering silences were nothing more than awkwardness from harmless accident. But then, there were moments that shattered that fragile illusion. Like the night, I found him sitting alone on the balcony, a beer in his hand and the city lights painting gold across his face. His expression was distant, eyes tracing patterns across the skyline, like he was searching for something just out of reach. "You good?" I asked from the doorway, unsure whether I was interrupting something private. He didn't answer right away. Finally, after a long pause, he said, "Do you ever think about how things would be if we were different?" The question hit harder than it should have. "Different how?" He shrugged, not looking at me. "I don't know. Just different." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You mean if I wasn't?" "Don't." His voice was sharp, too sharp. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" I pushed, my voice quieter but steadier than I felt. Michael finally turned to face me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. "I don't know. Maybe if I wasn't such a coward." The words knocked the air out of me. Coward? That wasn't the Michael I knew. The Michael who had always been confident, fearless even. The Michael who'd never hesitated to stand up for the people he cared about. But this wasn't about fear of confrontation or standing his ground. This was something deeper. "Mike, you're not a coward," I said, my voice soft, careful not to shatter the fragile honesty that had surfaced between us. "You're just confused." He let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, maybe. Or maybe I just don't want to admit things I'm not ready for." The silence between us was heavier than ever, thick with the weight of things neither of us dared to say. "Is this about that night?" I asked finally. He didn't answer, but his silence was loud enough. The next day, we barely spoke. Every movement in the apartment felt choreographed. Two people avoiding collision in a space too small for the distance growing between them. I caught myself watching him from the corner of my eye, looking for some sign that the conversation from the night before hadn't been a dream. But Michael was back behind his wall of casual indifference, joking about work and scrolling through his phone like nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. That evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I knocked on his door, the hesitation in my chest thick and uncomfortable. "Come in," he called, voice muffled through the wood. I pushed the door open to find him sitting on his bed, laptop open but clearly forgotten. His eyes met mine, tired but guarded. "We need to talk," I said, standing in the doorway. Michael closed the laptop with a quiet click. "Yeah," he agreed. "We do." I sat on the edge of his bed, careful to leave space between us. "What's going on, Mike? I mean, really going on?" He leaned back against the headboard, arms crossed like a shield. "I don't know. I keep thinking about that night. About the look on your face when I walked in." I swallowed hard. "What about it?" He stared at the ceiling, avoiding my gaze. It wasn't embarrassment. At least, not in the way I expected. It was something else. The words lodged in my throat. "Michael, just let me finish," he cut in, voice strained. "I thought I had everything figured out. Who I am, what I want. But being around you these past few weeks, I keep questioning it all." I couldn't breathe. "So what are you saying?" He looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time, There was no wall between us, just raw vulnerability. I don't know what I'm feeling, but it scares the hell out of me. The admission hit harder than anything else could have. Not because it confirmed my hopes or fears, but because it was real. Honest in a way that Michael had never let himself be before. You don't have to figure it all out right now, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not asking you to. But what if I can't? His voice cracked on the last word. What if I end up hurting you anyway? I reached out, resting my hand gently on his. Then I'll deal with it. But I'd rather have the truth, no matter how messy, than keep pretending this doesn't mean anything. His hand didn't pull away. For the first time, he let it stay there, our fingers barely touching, but saying everything words couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was full of possibility, scary, uncertain, but real. And for the first time, neither of us looked away.